to that. And the floor is yours, Aakar. We're waiting. We're listening to you.
Thanks. So, thank you to all of you. This will make a difference to the space that we are working on here, and I'll sort of speak about that towards the end. Why this this sort of gathering and this sort of material is necessary to try and improve the situation from where we are. I'll just very briefly talk about myself. I live in Bangalore, where I've been for the last decade. I just published a book about 4 or 5 months ago called Our Hindu Rashtra, which makes the point that Hindutva doesn't have a theory of state. It doesn't have a proper ideology. What it seeks is to brutalize minorities, particularly Muslims. And it has the space within the existing constitutional framework to be able to do that. I've shown how it's done that with laws and how it continues to do that with the laws. Before that, till November 2019, I was with the Amnesty in India. My term actually ended in June of 2019, but I had to stay back for a few more months because they couldn't find anybody to take my place. I was there for a 4.5-year term, beginning in 2015. Before that, I ran a business in Bombay from 2006 to 2010, a media services business that worked with News Corp, that worked with UNICEF, making shows for radio, for the midday meal scheme and so on. Before that, I was with newspapers. My last job in journalism was with a Gujarati daily called Divya Bhaskar. This was in Ahmedabad. And before that, I spent about a decade in journalism in places like Hyderabad and Bombay. I moved from Surat at the age of 25. And before that, for 7 years, I worked with the family textile business. We crimped and wove polyester yarn and fabric. I have a diploma in textile technology, and I've been working since the age of 18. That's my background. I'll go back to the note that I sent you.
Yeah.
So Amnesty has been around in this country for about 5 decades, and in this most recent version, there was a strategy to try and make sure that it wasn't kicked out or didn't die of its own lack of resource, as has happened over the last 4 or 5 times. And the way that this was done was to set up a trust which would raise money locally. That trust at the moment has about 3.5 crore rupees that has been frozen, and to set up a company that would deliver services to non-profits. The largest client was the Secretariat in London, and those accounts have been frozen as well. In the period that I was there, we sought to engage with the state because being evidence-based, you want, and the state being the largest agent of change, you want to be able to engage with it in a meaningful way in the democratic polities so that laws and policies can be changed. Unfortunately, in our part of the world, the state does not tend to engage with non-profit groups, especially those that work on rights, and they tend to be hostile, which was the experience that we had as well. So in the second year that I was there, we had a sedition case filed against us, which led to a loss of revenue on the side of the trust because we were not able to access the spaces in the public that we could to sign up members. At the point when I left in November 2019, we had 15,000 people paying us 500 rupees a month. So that was a significant source of income. And the way that we would sign these people up, mostly middle class, lanyard wearing sort of IT corporate types that we would speak to at cafeterias in the corporate spaces, that we would get half an hour or an hour daily at lunchtime. So that stopped because of the press that we got after the sedition case. The case, as I've said in my note, came out of the fact that we were taking a group of Kashmiri women who had lost their children and had not been told by the state what the status of the cases was. And people were offended that we did not also take up the case of Kashmiri Pandits and so on, which we have actually documented in the past, but it was felt at these gatherings that we were one-sided and Muslim focused. So this produced some violence outside the office. Some heads were broken. The government then was run by the Congress. The BJP held some dharnas. The complainant was the ABVP, which did not show up in court even once, and the court was the case was tossed out in January 2019. But it came with great damage, and in terms not just of the money, but the very minuscule access that we had to the state in terms of certain ministries like the railways that gave us space to work on things like sexual violence, that also closed. The way that Amnesty functions is that it does the evidence gathering normally over a period of years, and then that report is passed and it is sent to the state, and the state has time up to 6 months to respond to the findings. And the process is not adversarial. We want to help the state improve the way that it legislates and to improve the way that it delivers services. The first report that I was a part of was on Kashmir, AFSPA. It showed that since 1989, all the FIRs that the Jammu and Kashmir police had filed, which had resulted in a charge sheet, which I don't know if Sten might know what that means. It's the second process after the evidence has been gathered and the police finds that there is basis for the court to take up a prosecution. The file is then sent to Delhi, where either the MOD or the MHA, the defense or the Home Ministry, has a veto on whether or not this case can be tried in a civilian court. And there is a clause, Section 7 in AFSPA that lets the state do that. So our finding was that since 1989, not a single case of murder, torture, kidnap, rape had actually been sent into prosecution. In most cases, the government of India had not replied to the government of Jammu and Kashmir. The state did not reply to this, as is the case with most of the reports that we put out. We had about 3 years of work in this. But it would periodically put out stories saying that Amnesty was up to no good. In 2018, we had a raid from the ED, which came and froze the accounts that we ran for about 3 months till we were able to move court and get the accounts unfrozen. And there was no formal charge. The ED has sweeping powers. Normally what the government does is that it uses the instrument that is the most blunt, whether it's the CBI in the case of a criminal action or the ED when it comes to finance. So at that point, we had been charged with a violation under the civil law, FEMA, Foreign Exchange Management. And the court found when we moved the writ that the government had not followed due process when it froze the accounts and gave us a relief after about 90 days. But we weren't able to pay salaries in that period and had to let go about roughly about 120 colleagues. Most of the people who worked there were people making about 22,000 rupees a month. They were working on the street, trained to approach people, talk about the human rights work, and see whether they would sign up as members. After that, we worked through 2018 and 2019 for a year. In that period, we had raids and visitations from 3 or 4 separate agencies, including the MHA, who the Home Affairs Ministry that came and spent 2 days with us, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. We had several of our uh, documentation files, servers cloned without being told why this was being done. Uh, our phones were taken from us. Um, and uh, till now, and we are in 2021 in May, there no formal charge has been laid. So the state has the ability to be able to cripple the work of the kind that we do without necessarily having to follow any kind of legal process and without there being any kind of checks and balances. The month I left, there was a raid from the CBI again, November 2019. Once again, they cloned the servers, and this time for the same set of transactions that we had been accused of violations in 2018, the under FEMA, which was the civil law. This time we were accused of a fraud, which was a criminal case that the charge sheet has not been filed yet either. In 2020, a year after I left, the accounts were still open and about 100 colleagues, 140 I think in all, were working. And the ED came in once again, this time for the same set of transactions. They applied the money laundering law, which is a criminal. And this time they not only froze, but they also attached. This is a technical term, which means that if you want to have your assets restored, you can't go directly to court. You first have to go through a process within the ED, where an ED judge will look at your case, will take 6 months to determine whether you can have your assets back to use. If that judge says no, there is a process of internal appeal that takes another 6 months, only after which you can go back to court. So we are in about month 2 of that. If things go worst case scenario, there's another 10 months to go before we can move a court. So the system is designed, it seems, to make it difficult for you to survive. And what we are doing at the moment is a small set of volunteers who have decided to come back and try and see if it can be revived in some way. The work that we were doing in the time that I was there had to do with the Coal Bearing Areas Act, which is a law, central law, under which the government can take over Adivasi land without any recourse to justice. There is no real, all of the laws that protect Adivasis under the constitution are void before this one law. So this takes care of the fact that corporates that see a specific part of land that they wish to acquire will take it. We tried filing cases under the SCSP POA, or the Atrocities Act. There we took 500 Adivasis who had lost their lands and we took them to a police station. But the police would not file the FIR. They would take the complaint down because we went en masse, but they would not register the FIR. In Kashmir, we worked on AFSPA, which I've spoken about. Also, a pellet gun, which is a sort of name that we use for a 12-gauge shotgun firing birdshot out of unrifled barrels into protesting crowds, which has blinded more than 800 people. It has blinded children, babies who've been very far from where the guns have been fired. The shot tends to scatter. The gun has wounded those who have fired it as well, which is something we found out through PILs. But the state, though the Supreme Court has taken some sort of interest in the state not using this weapon, which is not actually used in any other part of India, has not come down on the state and has not banned the use of it. Then we've got preventive detention, which is there all over India, but practiced especially harshly in some parts, including Kashmir. The PSA Act gives the state the right to hold people for 2 years without a crime or a trial. So the report we had was on minors who were picked up and the rotating door. So people who worked on civil rights, who were activists, were picked up, jailed, released on a court's order, and then picked up again the next day without there being any kind of relief. This sort of work did not attract the kind of attention from the state that we had expected. It was quite negative in the way that the state responded to us. Even the politicians within Kashmir found it difficult to meet us. People from the, I tried to meet Omar Abdullah, and I was actually face to face with him in his office, but he sort of turned and ran away. So I think that the capture by Delhi of such spaces is total, and I think that groups that work on human rights and on subjects like these need to be alive, if not thriving. And that's the reason I think that this group might be able to help us. We found that advocacy in foreign spaces is the best way to put the pressure on the state in India. That India still maintains the sort of carapace of Nehruvian secularism. When the diplomat meets somebody in Europe or in Brussels or in the US, she doesn't say that this is the sort of Hindu Rashtra, and she says that we are a secular, a pluralist democracy, rule of law, and so on. So there is some space to pressure the state in India and to hold it to account on its own laws. And we believe that the reason why CAA, though it was legislated, has not had its rules framed is things like this. It's the parliament in Europe having a motion which is condemnatory in very strong words, which the government of India doesn't like. Also, I think Kashmir, the net blockade which lasted for 18 months ended 2 weeks after the Biden administration took office. And one reason for that is that a Democrat in Congress, Representative Jaipal, had tabled a motion that was once again quite condemnatory and using language of the sort that the Indian state and the ME is not used to listening to. And if this pressure continues to build, there is some space for the state to behave in India. So I think that we are very happy to engage with groups like yours, because we believe that there is something very specific and the material that we can gain from this. Thanks.
Thank you, Aakar, because this is precisely what we believe too. I mean, one of the objectives of this group is to inform our governments, who are supposed to be informed, of course, but we may deny that they know. And when it is in the public, others can take up the issues, including journalists, students, think tanks. And incidentally, we will not go into that today because it would take us too far. But incidentally, the last EU-India summit yesterday was prepared in a very specific manner by the European Parliament that has passed a resolution that was very strongly worded, mentioning Kashmir, mentioning human rights. So gradually we see that some changes is probably taking place, and you're right. This kind of pressure is probably the most effective one. But we will not go into that. We will go back to your presentation, because there are many things, very interesting things that may be further clarified. I don't know whether Shruti, Faisal, Sten, you have questions. I have a couple of questions myself, but I would leave the floor with pleasure if any of you wants to start. No? Okay, let me start. Oh, sorry, someone. Yes, Shruti, please.
No, I think Sten wanted. Didn't you want to say?
No, I thought that you wanted to say something.
No, I do actually, but I'm happy for the chair. I'm also happy for the chair to start. I do have a couple of questions myself. I just thought you as the chair you should use the convention and start.
No, I don't. Ladies first.
Oh, ladies first. Okay. Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. I mean, of course, one has followed the human rights story and your career and also what has happened to Amnesty quite closely, but then there are many other such groups, Greenpeace and the like. So my question, Aakar, to you is actually twofold. One, that India is not alone in not liking Amnesty International, right? As a state, as a government. Most governments, democratic governments, I remember, for instance, the kerfuffle in Britain after Guantanamo Bay and the story around Amnesty's offices in central London and the directorship and that kind of controversy. So, of course, you are, as it were, a conscience keeper of all kinds of governments. My question to you is twofold. Uh, do you think this has to do with the fact that there is a lack of appreciation of human rights in India, including by liberals? Or is it because amnesty and human rights is seen to be foreign? These are two very different things. After all, liberalism was also foreign. It got made Indian. Communism was also not indigenous. So the issue is that why is there, this hesitancy towards human rights? Is it because, and then amnesty? And I don't think it's just the Modi government. I'm just talking about a general kind of atmosphere. And then, of course, a second question, a different question, which is about this particular government. Given that there is many governments have been hesitant, especially on the question of Kashmir and human rights, why is this government particularly thin-skinned on this criticism?
So,
I mean, after all, after all, you've mentioned Abdullah, Umar Abdullah. I mean, you could, I grew up in the 80s in Chandigarh, so, Kashmir was next door. And so this is a very long story, and you have also
yeah.
indigenous, as it were, human rights groups, which are also then, put away or, people. My question is that, I mean, why did the Modi government, use these kinds of methods to kind of cut off your money supplies, as it were? It's not that, amnesty was welcomed with open arms or with a bed of roses, that's not its relationship with governments.
No, so I'd say you're absolutely right that the state in India and generally speaking in our part of the world is hostile to the idea of human rights, hostile to the idea of fundamental rights even. And I think that the gradual expansion of what is called the reasonable restrictions has more or less ended most of the fundamental rights. So if you look at, for instance, propagation, or if you look at the right to occupation, because of the fact that the state and the state feels that a large section of the population feels uncomfortable, if not what's the word, offended by the idea that a propagation is a right and a fundamental right. It has sought to curb it in the way that it can constitutionally through damaging the right itself. And I think that human rights is seen as an irritant in a business of running the state. And this hasn't changed whether the government has been run by the BJP or by the Congress. I don't think there are amnesty and groups like it. There are many groups like it, and many groups that are far more braver and have done far more work than us. I think it should be recognized that on issues like Gujarat, which is a very difficult subject to work on, it is the local groups that have done most of the lifting. So it is not new, and I think that the Constitution and the amendments give the state the space to be able to say that this is not something that we want to give too much space to, and that has always been the case. I think with Kashmir, the problem is that because it is internationalized in some way, the government doesn't have full control over it in the way that it does, say, the rights of the Adivasis or the rights of the Dalits, or on a cow slaughter, or on, let's say, love jihad. Because I think that there are some players, at least in the external space, that feel that they can actually intervene and maybe have some sort of leverage. So I think what we did in 2019 maybe was not necessarily thought through, and then we saw repercussions of it, both on the strategic side and on the side of the UN taking it up once again after decades. Um, and so the government feels especially that this is the sort of thing that should not be spoken about, whether externally and certainly not within the country. The groups that get hit the hardest tend to be ones that are working on issues that are linked to Muslims, especially linked to Kashmir. So I would say that those are the two things that I know. Yeah.
Sure. No, that's very important. And I'll return to some of the issues you've just raised, Aakar, but staying as a Kashmir-related question.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for this very important presentation. First, just a quick comment about the statement about the government not having a theory of the state. David Lewis is arguing in a forthcoming book on autocratization in India that there is an idea, and it comes from Carl Schmitt, the authoritarian ideologue of the Weimar Republic. And this is something to look into, because there is like a model there which is mimicked, not only in India, but also in many places in Europe and other parts of the world, in China as well. So that's something to look in there. There is an idea, and it is expressed in a very interesting way there. So look out for that. I was wondering about Kashmir, because I have some contacts there and so on, but there's so little news coming out from this region right now. And I was thinking about, for example, the People's Alliance for the Gupta Declaration and so on. Is there, now that Amnesty is gone, there is who can they align with on the outside, so to speak, to champion the cases for so many of the issues that are important in Kashmir and so on? Is there something happening here which we're missing because there's so little media news coming out from this region? Or is it reflecting the fact that nothing is happening in this region now because everything is basically strictly under a lockdown still? What is your opinion on that?
So I think that the mainstream parties in Kashmir have this sort of modus vivendi with the state in India, where they will not use advocacy externally to put pressure. They will try and play by whatever rules that the government in Delhi has, and if those rules require it to align with a party that openly hates their own identity, they will be fine with that. And I think what has happened in 2019 is that has run its course, that can no longer be the basis on which the polity in Kashmir is run. We can't have a party now in Kashmir, since we don't have a statehood there. So what was given as a morsel, saying that, okay, you run the state and then you partner with us and we will let you keep power there, limited power, but you have, that is no more the case. Has the future of that been thought through? I would speculate and say no, because this is not a government and this is not a leader who necessarily thinks things through before he executes the larger decisions. So I suspect and I fear that we will have a return to the kind of disillusionment, not just at the level of the wider public, which never went away, but I think also creeping into the political space, which does not have any room at the moment to be able to operate. And I think particularly at a time when the country is going through a crisis where the state needs to intervene in a very large way, and I'm speaking of the COVID thing, we don't have the kind of contact between the state and the parties and the public in Kashmir.
Mm. Thank you, Aakar. Shall we return to Amnesty? Faisal, do you have a question on Amnesty?
Yeah, a couple of questions. One has to do, before we get to Amnesty in particular, on what you were saying, Aakar, about the courts. So you made two very interesting points. One was that governments do not need to change laws to do what they do, which obviously shows that there's a structural condition here that permits violations of human rights, or on the contrary, the protection of human rights, both of which are covered by the law as it exists and probably goes back to colonial times. The second thing you said that I thought was interesting had to do with the relief that amnesty has occasionally received from the courts. So I wanted to ask you whether you think the institutions of the state are still suitably pluralized as to allow you to get relief occasionally, or if they are working at counter purposes, or what's happening, or is it the case that the Supreme Court is more recalcitrant, as you described it to us on Kashmir, but the high courts might be more amenable for other issues? So that's one set of questions about the courts. And then coming to amnesty, could you put it in the context of these other domestic civil liberties groups, of which there are a number, PUCL, et cetera, and many of them deriving from the period of the emergency, some perhaps from before. The impression I get is they tend to be single issue. Volunteers come together for single issues and then disperse again, though the name might live longer. Is there any formal or even informal relationship between amnesty and these kinds of groups? And how might they be supported, do you think? And do they also fall under this rubric of foreign interference that Shruti had described earlier?
So I'll take the second question first. The relief we've got has been basically on the side of civil law, because the commercial disputes have been so well litigated in this country over a century. There is a precedent, and it's difficult for the courts to diverge beyond a point from it. It takes a very brave judge to be able to cast aside 4 or 5 decades worth of jurisprudence on a specific point. I think it's on the criminal side where we will actually now go and approach court that we will find out whether or not they stay true. My guess is that because of COVID, the courts have had some sort of leverage to push back against the government, because some of them might be acquiescent because of the fact that they agree with what this government does. Some of them might be purely opportunistic, but as a group, I suspect that there are many of them who want to take back the space that has been ceded to the state in the last 7 years. To the first question, I think that there is ample space within the constitutional framework for a Hindu Rashtra to be brought about, and it needs only 2 things. They want the political marginalization of the Muslims, which has been achieved. The other thing is that the law as it stands can be used to legislate things which are discriminatory and not be seen as such within the constitutional framework. So for instance, Gujarat has, for an ostensibly commercial crime, which is a cow slaughter, the punishment is life. And there was a man who was convicted in 2019, a Muslim man, obviously, of serving beef at his daughter's wedding and not being able to prove that it was beef. The burden of proof has been reversed, and this is actually allowed under Indian law, that if I'm found with a smoking gun next to a corpse, it's up to the state to be able to prove that I murdered. But if someone accuses me of having beef in my fridge, it's for me to prove to the satisfaction of the state that that beef is not beef. And this man was actually sentenced. The High Court was extremely embarrassed and then let him off on something called judicial discretion, which is not part of common law or jurisprudence. But as has happened in Pakistan, the state has passed laws which the judiciary cannot actually abide with, and they cannot pass those sentences because they are a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also, I think the burden of proof has been reversed on the so-called love jihad law. It's not for an adult woman to say that the family she has married into of her own volition. It's for the family to prove to the satisfaction of the state that they have not coerced her. And there have been cases filed in all of the BJP states in the last 12 months after these laws have been passed. There is a law in Gujarat which prevents Muslims from buying or leasing properties outside of their ghettos, the Disturbed Areas Act that Jafar has actually written quite a bit about. And that law has been tightened over the years. So the last tightening came last year. It gives the state at the level of the local bureaucrat full freedom to be able to determine which neighborhoods he or she will actually allow Muslims into and which not, and so on. So there is lots of space for continual mischief. we did not have beef lynching as a category of violence till 2015, when the possession of beef was criminalized by two states, Maharashtra, Haryana, after the Prime Minister pushed the BJP to do it, and then the violence started. So I would say that there is still a lot of space for the BJP, and there is nothing in the constitution that would stop it from doing what it wants. There seems to be very little remorse in these people at scenes of public violence, which have become visible now. 20 years ago, you didn't have the case that you would have people who were brutalized in daylight, and you would have scenes of this shot, and these would be almost celebrated. I don't know if that's the word, but certainly it seems to be the case that we have great glee in sharing the visuals of men and women and even children that we are dealing with in a barbaric manner. So I think that we have actually arrived in that constitutional space. I'll just go back to something that Sten said, in that they've never had a theory of state on the economic side. That if you look at for 20 years, the BJP said that all, and this is till 1973 under Mr. Vajpayee, that all of the monthly incomes would be capped at rupees 2,000. Anything over that would be taken by the state. Minimum incomes would be 200 rupees, 1:10 ratio. All of these things have been discarded. Nothing has been consistent with them, except for the fact that they're going after things that actively brutalize minorities, especially Muslims. Every other part of the state, if you look at foreign policy, national security, economy, that seems to be negotiable. So at least the way that I would read it is that the way that they see the state is not something to use as an instrument to be able to do something else, except for the very specific task that they have been doing. And to the third question, I think that civil society here is extremely passionate, but not very, what's the word, MBAized. So we don't have outcomes that we go after. The Excel sheeting is not done. The power mapping, the analysis of what is needed to move the needle from northwest to northeast is not really done. We tend to go to the barricades and then we sort of express ourselves. But as a scientific exercise of how to bring about a specific change in law or in policy, we don't seem to know it. Having said that, the two groups that seem to know it have been spontaneous. So Muslims, especially Muslim women, have been able to veto a law that India passed but has not been able to apply because of the force that they brought on the street. And the farmers from Northwest and North India have been able to veto a law that Mr. Modi apparently feels very strongly about, but has not been able to apply. So I think that the spontaneity of civil society, though I should say that unlike the Muslim women, the farmers groups are actually organized at the level of unions and so on. So they're not the same. But certainly they don't come at it from the point of view, from the theory of civil society that we will have this sort of calibration of what we need to do, this much research and this much litigation and this much advocacy. And passion in that sense seems to have helped them.
If I may ask, thank you for these very, I would say, comprehensive responses to the questions, Aakar. If I may return to your story with Amnesty, because for many years there were harassment practices, there were personal targeting. What kind of help did you receive from outside? I mean, of course, I suppose Amnesty in London extended its support. That's the minimum you can expect from them. But what about foreign countries, foreign governments, embassies? Any signal, anything?
So they would meet, but they would not act. And one of the reasons is, especially in the last 48 months, the European Union seems to believe that India is a counterbalance to China, and that if it needs to be able to manage China, and they don't seem to know how that is to be done, because China pushes back very strongly, as we've seen in the recent past, then India in some way is to be accommodated within the framework of the West,
Yeah.
or whatever word it is that they use. And so they are hesitant to bring the full force of the EU down on India. And if you look at the spectrum of the actions they can take, with, let's say, sanctions being at one extreme and off the record conversations being at the other, it tends to be on this side rather than on that. So
yeah.
Having said that, I think because the behavior of the government in India and the state has reached a point where the EU cannot necessarily ignore the calls within itself, because it is not a monolith. So there are lots of groups within the EU, in some nations, Germany especially, I would say, that are the Nordic nations, which are actually concerned about the way that things are unfolding here.
So from this side, you received visitors, you received signals, support.
Yeah, so that EU statement that you mentioned has quite a few strong paragraphs on the human rights situation in India. It mentions us actually also, and it says that what has happened to us is not a good. So there are some statements. We tend to be able to meet people that we want to, but I think that the net effect of what human rights violations are in India. So I would say, for instance, that a lot of Europeans are particularly agitated about the group called the Bhima Koregaon 16. That people that they have worked with and known for decades, lawyers, academics, poets, and so on, have been jailed without charge of trial, now without a trial, with no recourse to bail. So they feel particularly strongly about such things. And I think also the young people who've been jailed after the CAA movement and the violence that came in Delhi after that, they seem to find a lot of resonance in the European embassies and groups that work on rights. But so far, while the state in India has listened to them in some way, it hasn't acted. What it says is, oh, we have a legal process, rule of law, it's in the courts, we can't help it, and so on. So they use that to be able to deflect.
Yeah. And personally, have you been targeted, harassed, trolled?
I was actually arrested and bailed for one case which a BJP legislator filed last year for a tweet. But the thing is that because of the amnesty name, a lot of us are much more fortunate than people who do not operate under the kind of, a framework of the INGO. So I would say that though Tista is much more effective at what she does, or I would say that people like Umar Khalid and so on, they don't have that degree of protection that the rest of us might have. And the rest of us are a minority. I would say that most of the right space in India is occupied by very brave people who do not have the kind of kind of a cover that we do. And it's for them that we need to make sure that there is at least some groups working that are not under the danger of being shut down all the time. Yeah. I think India, because it's such a large space and because it seems to be functional, you've got courts, you've got a police space, and you've got laws and so on. You can have a lot of mischief happening where it seems to be all okay. So I think that the CAA arrestees would be a classic example of that. That the state would cook up cases, and at the level of the magistrate, the cases would be tossed out because the evidence, as we've seen, is total garbage. But it would be seen as episodic rather than systemic. So yeah. you would see 20 cases where the same thing has happened, that there is no case at all. You pick up a Muslim man or woman, even the complainant in a case is made the accused in the same case, and the court tends to toss it out, but that's a very slow, a process. And you've got the emblematic, charismatic people who are in jail, Safuza Zargar, Khalid, and so on. Yeah.
That was my last question precisely about the judiciary, because now many facets of the judiciary. Well, you knew them before, but you know them even more directly now. So when you look at the different actors in the judiciary and with your ongoing process, I mean, procedure and the verdict you're waiting for, what is your, let's say, what have you learned? What is your assessment of this system, the judiciary, and the different levels?
So I think our problem in the way that we function is that you need a really highly paid lawyer to be able to get justice in this country. And it doesn't matter whether you are Amnesty or whether you are whoever else. To be able to even get a hearing, you need a very big lawyer on your side. And lawyers in the UK are appalled at what it is that lawyers in, maybe the word is not appalled, maybe they're thrilled and delighted. But for a single hearing, you can get bankrupted for something that didn't even come to the bench. So you could just get a date, but that guy will send you a bill for 1.5 crore rupees. So if you have that kind of money, it is likely that you will get a kind of legal outcome which is based on law. If you don't, we did a piece of work in Amnesty which looked at a law which said that, very, very reasonable law, which said that if you are accused of a crime which is not serious, and if you've spent more than 50% of your maximum possible punishable time already in jail without being convicted, you should be automatically qualified for bail. No jail in India actually knew that the law was there and how it worked. So if you have access to the system and be able to influence it in some way, you might be able to get justice for most of us, 99%. I don't know what the number is. It's definitely more than 9 in 10. There is no law. You will just stay in jail, and yeah. And I'm not even talking about the cases where the state has a specific interest in keeping you in jail. The state could not care less, but it's so difficult to be able to negotiate your way through the system that it's a nightmare. Yeah, I hope that we become, in some sense, a test case, because we have this unusual situation where the government has told the court that it doesn't have any problem with us operating the accounts that we hold, because there is no law stopping us from actually, using that money. But it has unofficially told the banks not to let us use it. Now, I don't know how that works in a democratic space. The bankers are too scared. They will not even take our calls. And it's not because we've been charged. There is no charge sheet. It's just that the state can use its leverage to call HDFC Bank. You've got all this sort of India shining corporate kind of nonsense. These people don't even have the courage to be able to follow the law if the state says that you shouldn't follow it. So yeah, it's tough.
And that's why you don't need new laws, because it's exactly not because of the laws that we have this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but I think that with the BJP, one thing we've had is that they have been extremely enthusiastic about putting into place new laws. Every year that they've come in, something has gone after either the Muslim or the Christian, to a lesser extent the Dalit and the Adivasi. I would say that the crime of Hindutva against those latter groups is one of omission, but on the former, it's totally commissioned. They are going after the Muslims, and it is astonishing how much patience the Muslims of India have shown.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Aakar. I had promised that we would not take more than 1 hour of your time on a Sunday. So if there is one irrepressible question from my colleagues or additional question from my colleagues, we can. If not, just tell us what the next step, just to know when we can maybe meet again, if you have a kind of chronology of forthcoming events in mind.
So we have sent a letter to the enforcement directorate saying that the court order says very clearly that the government doesn't have a problem if we operate the account. So will you please send a letter to the banks and let us do so? If they don't, then we move the Supreme Court, and that should happen in the next 15 days. If we get a hearing there, which is possible because we'll try and get a very senior lawyer to represent us if we can, because all of this is free, then I think that in a month or maybe a couple of months, we should have some sort of resolution one way or the other. If the answer from the court is no, that they will not give us a relief in the short term, we will need to see whether we can work a pro bono. Now, the problem with that is that the secretariat, because it is a bureaucracy, doesn't want us to. It feels that we are putting ourselves in the line of danger and that we should not be allowed to work at all. But the counter to that is that unless we push back, the state will sort of continue to do what it has with us over the last 7 years. So we need to be able to convince Amnesty in London as well to be able to let us, not that they have a veto. I don't think that this is something that is a direct relationship, but civil society tends to work on the basis of a consensus, and it's quite difficult to arrive at that often. So let's see. I think that I'm quite hopeful of the fact that we will be able to get some sort of relief, and then we can resume work at least on the 2 or 3 difficult subjects, Kashmir, UAPA, and so on.
Well, we wish you the best indeed. Keep us informed. Tell us what are the developments. We will,
Sure.
in any case, edit this conversation and see how we can publicize it and send it in any case to people who can have a say, can have a word of support at one level or the other. But yes, tell us how things are on your side whenever something happens. Of course, everything must be slowed down now because I suppose COVID makes every court less active. But yes, tell us how things are unfolding themselves on your side.
I will, and I think it's extremely important, the work that you're doing, even though you've taken a really big bite. I think that the times we are going through require academic engagement at your level with your sort of expertise across a range of subjects, because we are going through very rapid change in a very short a period of time. And this needs to be documented, this needs to be put out to the world, and the world needs to know where it is that we are headed. It is not normal anymore in this country.
Yeah. No,
Thank you for doing it.
We are building archives, but we are trying to do more and to hopefully, of course, put pressure on our governments for, as you said in the beginning, make sure that that has some effect on your government.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you to all of you for your time, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.